What's up, my doom scrolling friends? My name is Chrome, and I want to do a beginner guide for the tower defense game called Gnomes. After that, in some weeks, there will be an advanced guide utilizing much more in-game footage, but for now, this video stays very theory-craft-esque, as I have to explain quite a bit of mechanics. So let's start with the overall gameplay. At the beginning, you are choosing your guilds, quite a bit to choose from, but for now let's start with the first one called the Rogues. So in the top left, your lives, of course, you begin with 10. If it drops down to 0, you of course will lose the run. Right next to that, your current gold and your income for each day. Right next to it, it displays the current day. It's 1 out of 16. This is because a standard run has 16 days. At the final day, there will a king appear. If you beat him, you of course have won the run. However, you can still choose to play the endless mode, which for this game remains the core mechanic. Or let's say the most fun part of this game. Right next to it, your current population. Every gnome needs a house. Right now it's 0 out of 0 because I haven't placed any house and I haven't placed any gnome. Still, some playstyles, some strategies might wiggle around this population count. Right next to it, it shows your banishes. These are used to remove items from the game, from your buildable line and from the shop. And after all, banishes remain a very strong mechanic of this game. Down below on the left, there is your current item line. So the rogues are starting with a dice, so you have one little free roll per day. Down below to the left is of course the long-term much needed shop. It shows some items which are pretty much randomized. You can of course buy them, you can banish them, and of course you can reroll them. We'll talk about all these items in a bit. To the right is of course your current buildable line, some houses, some knife gnomes, and the current income crop called sunflower. So in this game, one of the main ideas to gain gold is to place some crops, mainly on fertilized ground displaced by these green grass things. Now, because I have placed too many of these sunflowers, I can of course also undo my latest actions. I'm back to 12 gold again. Let's place some house and the knife gnome. And this one will eventually get rid of the enemies spawning from the bottom if I press and turn. Now, placing crops to gain income and build towers to defeat enemies is of course the simple principle of this game. However, its decision making can become quite tough the longer the game goes. Even more so because enemy scaling becomes tougher and tougher with each day. Now, before we talk about all the gnomes / towers, some words to some mechanics. Armor on enemies will give them a chance to block incoming damage entirely for each percentage. So 33 armor has a 33% chance to negate a hit entirely, which can lead to a situation where the normal enemies have even more HP than the actual king, cause the blocking effect is actually that insane. When it comes to stun effects, blunderbuss gnomes are stunning for 0.6 seconds with each shot, same as the flail gnomes. Flail gnomes, however, can obtain the sleeping potion and stun enemies for 1.2 seconds. In addition, all gnomes can stun via an item called Sapphire, leading to a stun effect of 0.1 seconds. And now comes the important point. Every stun effect has a cooldown, or let's say an immunity of the same amount of stunning time. 0.1 second stun time will lead to an immunity to to stun effects for 0.1 seconds, and a 1.2 second stun will lead to a 1.2 seconds time of immunity. And you cannot play around the fact that if you stun enemies consecutively, enemies will need twice the amount of time that they would need to walk through your entire maze that they would need without it, regardless of what type of stun effect and or slowing effect you are using. However, based on a feeling I have, and I can absolutely not confirm this, but it might be eventually better to purely use wizards, archer or knife gnomes for the stun effects, but this one needs some sharp analysis. So let's talk about all the gnomes/towers the game has to offer. The archer gnome attacking in a straight line, making them easy to use for their relatively low cost, and they stay useful throughout the entire run due to their item called Bodkin Arrow that lets them ignore armor entirely. And for now, this is the only type of armor piercing the game has to offer. The quiver will lower their cooldown by 20%, but long term you might switch this one out, as placing coffee is the much better play. Axe gnomes attacking 3 tiles in front of them, making them a good bread and butter kind of choice for dealing damage. Their related item, their flannel shirt, makes it so that they attack 20% faster for each tree that is around in a 1 tile radius, and those can stack multiple times. The whetstone gives them +1 damage, which is good early on. However, later on there might be better items for all of your gnomes. Now, just recently I realized a pretty strong interaction with the item called Berserker Ring. So if they crit, they attack in all directions, which for the Axe gnome mean their attacks are overlapping to some extent, at least on 2 tiles with each attack. Blunderbuss gnomes are costly, they deal good damage in a gigantic radius, and they got a stun effect, but they keep a relatively high cooldown with their attacks throughout a longer period in the run until you are able to get some coffee and the percolator to get more attack speed on everything. Fragmentation rounds is an amazing item to deal 1 bonus damage that splashes through enemies, and what seems kind of laughable at first gets multiplied a lot the more blunderbuss gnomes you are building. On top of that, you might even be able to combine those fragmentation rounds with some garlic or slowing effects. We will certainly come back to this item in the advanced guide, as it is situational, one of the strongest items in the game. Powder charge is the usual +1 bonus damage. Again, this one might be switched out for a better item long term. So flail gnomes have the very much same attack pattern as axe gnomes, and their related items are the sleeping potion to stun enemies twice as long, and the morning star, which increases their crit damage by 100%. This of course makes them dealing pretty high damage for a relatively high cooldown. This can be an issue in the early game, and eventually if you are in the super late game aiming for monk rope strategies, the morning star stops working because you cannot deal crits anymore. However, flail gnomes and blunderbuss gnomes are very good if they are paired with something that has better attack speed, such as the knife gnomes. These guys are very good in the early game and even in the mid game. However, you may want to transition into something else in the later stages of the game. Still, just recently the Bali song got buffed. It's now increasing their attack speed by 75%, while only decreasing their damage by 1. Rusty Shiv stayed the same with a plus 35% crit chance, and because they only attack in 1 tile around them, they may not seem very strong. However, you can still come very far only by using knife gnomes exclusively, if you play with your economy correctly, of course. Next up is the spear gnome. Their attack speed is kind of okay. They attack in 2 tiles around them, and they come with very strong items. The one is called the pike, which gives them +1 radius, which sounds kind of underwhelming, but if you use it correctly, you can create an absolute meat grinder. Even more so because the strategy manual makes it so that adjacent spear gnomes get +1 damage the more spear gnomes are around them. Again, you can create an absolute meat grinder with some spear gnomes. And if you place some statues and or some blunderbuss and flail gnomes with them, you get a pretty efficient setup. And last but certainly not least are the wizard gnomes. They come with a very high cost, which can be an issue early on. However, they deal good damage, but have a relatively high cooldown and attack in a gigantic radius. So I consider these ones as very costly but very high quality, even more so because it's actually splash damage. The Palantir item gives them +1 radius, which can be a little bit weird at times. However, eventually if you know how to use it, it becomes very strong. And their last item is called the Summoning Portal, so the wizard get a 10% chance to summon another gnome. And this one is one of the best items in the entire game. And we will certainly talk about this one in the advanced guide, as this is leading to one of the best strategies in the game. So far to a short overview of all the existing gnomes so far. So now let's talk about all the other stuff in the game. So next up are all the placeable items. Bamboo, it blocks enemies and spread each day. It is tagged as a tree and wheat, so you can pair it with a sawmill. For the most part, I found this one rather annoying to deal with, as the spreading and blocking is way too crazy and you might need to invest gold via dynamite to get rid of it, if you are not planning to use it somehow. Next up is a barrel. So the barrel is a very useful item to block enemies away from your economy, and it is movable wherever you want on a free tile, making this one stay viable throughout the entire game. There is a related item called Philosopher's Spoon that makes it even count as a house, giving +1 population. As crazy strong as this one might sound, it might fall off heavily in the super long run, as the item slot might have better use for damaging items. However, the Philosopher's Spoon is absurdly strong in the early game and maybe even the mid game for min-maxing reasons. Coming to the beehive, it gives +1 gold each day for each different crop or wheat within 2 tiles radius, making this one a high quality building for economy. Even more so because you can stack the beehives, building them in a straight line, even blocking enemies from trampling the crops. However, its initial cost with 7 gold is relatively high if you want to stack it. Beehives might be the second best crop-based economy in the game, only being outscaled by corn and windmills. So for the body tree, planted it will give you +1 banishes, and it can be paired with a sawmill and certain other effects. We will talk about banishes at the end of the video, as this item is used for the so-called meta strategies of this game. So situational speaking, the body tree remains one of the best items in the game. So the caravans are the most expensive houses, but they are also the best, as they are movable, and this side effect cannot be underestimated, as it always stays viable throughout the entire run to move these around. However, because you might build multiple hundreds, if not thousands of houses, the cost might end up being relatively high compared to the much weaker but cheaper tent. So the church is in a kind of wonky spot because despite banishes being very strong, the opportunity cost for the church is relatively high, as if you place churches, you cannot build more economy, especially early on, and you still have to surround them with houses. Still, churches have some crazy strong potential in the super long run if you are aiming for the monk ropes, only getting outscaled by corn and windmills, if I am correct here. So daisies are in an unsteady spot. In the early game, their automatically spreading effect is absurdly strong, However, they are blocking tiles, and due to their RNG nature, they remain relatively low quality, since each tile only generates +1 income with a 33% chance. They might explode relatively quickly, yet you still want to transition into a higher quality income as soon as possible. Now the goats come with a very high building cost. This is related due to the need that you want to place multiple of them, so the initial cost of 5 for the goat itself will come back as manured fertilized soil that you would otherwise use the menu on for 2 gold each. So a block of 3 by 3 goats cost 85 gold, but you will save 18 gold multiplied by each day, of course. So in the long run, these goats are very worth it. However, eventually you might find yourself in a spot where you cannot keep up with the pacing of the bonus economy you need to keep up with the enemy scaling. So I find the goats pretty strong, even though their value might be a bit abstract, and the fact that you will have to micro them each day might become tedious long term. So for the hedge, it blocks enemies for 1 gold, no strong feeling about that one, but you might want to use that one on the wasteland map to make those nuclear bombs explode. Again, no strong feeling about this one, but it can be quite good. So next up is the standard house. It gives +1 population and it blocks enemies, so nothing too crazy. So one important information might be that you need a buildable house in your line of buildable items to get offered a gnome in the shop, otherwise this won't happen. Coming to the landmines, these are in a weird spot right now because they can save your run, but their damage falls off heavily as the run progresses. So for now I can only recommend to step away from them, same as real life, until the devs have implemented items related to landmines that lets them scale in the long run. Right now, currently, they are way too terrible to ever be considered. Next up is Lantana. Carlos Lantana, my favorite singer. It deals 1 damage when trampled and it spreads each day. So I find this one rather annoying to deal with, but you might want to use them on the desert map to get rid of those explosion guys. Cause otherwise their damage is way too crazy, if not run throwing. So the sawmill is a pretty safe economy, as it also blocks enemies and cannot be trampled if you line it up with some bamboo or body trees. However, their per tile income isn't the greatest, if I am correct here, in comparison with wheats and corn. But once again, being able to block enemies away is sometimes a pretty big fat argument for this type of economy. So coming to the sprinklers, I haven't used them very often, but they might be very good with sunflowers or the yams. No strong feeling about this item. Now coming to the statues. Statues come with a very high initial cost, but placed correctly they are certainly worth it. Still, you might want to think twice before placing them, especially multiple times in one spot. To be honest, partially I find these one kinda tough to use correctly. Now coming to the taverns. Taverns are a good addition to the normal crops, even more so when you have planned building around them very early on. With the guild called Townsfolk, you might want to focus on them entirely. In other cases, it's more of a late game thing, and in other cases, it might even get too tedious to place them. Overall, a pretty good item, but I also don't have a strong feeling about this one. Coming to the tents, they are cheap and effective, and I find this one relatively annoying because they can get trampled so easily. Still, in some cases, they are very worth it for min-maxing reasons. Again, long term, you might place hundreds, if not thousands of houses, so saving the 1 gold for each house can be quite influential. So for the windmills, long story short, if you use wheats and corn, you pretty much always want to place them because the cost for not building these are way too high long term. So far to the placeable items. Now let's go over all the crops, starting with the sunflower and its related item called the sun. Are you winning, sun? Now this item or the crops I barely ever use these days because eventually this 33% chance to get 2 gold evens out in the long run. So let's say you have 100 tiles of sunflowers, and over the course of multiple days the bonus will be even out to 133 gold, since you cannot overcome statistics. So eventually the sunflowers are turning into a mediocre kind of income. Next up are the wheats, +1 each day and +1 when adjacent to other corn. This one does not stack, so the bonus only applies one time. Still, together with the windmill, this one is kind of okay, since the building cost is relatively mediocre, or at least 2 gold less than the corn. Next up is the yams, 50% chance of +1 gold each day, but it also spreads each day on fertilized ground each day. So because it's 50-50, it's a little bit better than the daisies and their related item called strong tubers, making it so that the yams are spreading even on normal ground, making this one extremely cost effective. However, later on you might want to transition into a higher quality crop. So the beans will fertilize adjacent ground each day, and to be honest, I don't have a strong feeling about the beans. They are kind of okay, and with their related item called plutonium rod, you may or may not want to transition into a beehive economy. So next up is the coffee. Long story short, this one with their related item called the percolator is pretty much mandatory for the so-called meta game. Same as the foxglove and its related item called bottled fairy. Long term, you may want to place the exact amount of foxglove to be able to level up your gnomes to the highest level. And this is working because the foxglove, after all, gives absolute bonus experience, which is not reduced by items like the golden top. Next up is the garlic, which is absurdly strong in the early game when the +1 bonus damage is relatively strong. This can lead towards a very efficient early game where you can spend even more gold to your economy. Next up is the rice, pretty much in the same boat as the sunflower. No strong feeling about this one. However, combined with the cotton, it gets kind of okay. Next up is the Tulsi. Long story short, we have to skip this one to the advanced guide, as it would be slightly better to show this one with practical footage. Next up is the corn. Pretty much as I pointed out before, this one is the best and the highest quality crop and income in the game. Still, its building cost is relatively high, and if you are not careful enough, you may throw a run because of greed. Once again, cotton combined with the rice, pretty okay on swamp and the sewers map when combined. Next up is the galaxy hops, which we certainly have to skip to the advanced guide. But long story short, this one and its related item called galaxy hops is one of the best items in the game and absolutely mandatory for the so-called meta game. Next up are the huckleberries, and I barely ever use them at all because I find these one kind of terrible. Peppers and their related item called chili jam, of course, very strong, as you can reach 100% crit relatively early, relatively cheap. However, the freshly item added called Pepper X makes the late game a little bit tough to calculate, in a sense that it can be kinda tough to think about what you want, the crit chances or the monk rope interaction. We will certainly go over this in the advanced guide. Same as the roses, these are one of my favorite crops, as you can go for a pretty insane playstyle together with the briar heart. And in the very same boat are the cactus, +1 gold each day, and they deal damage to adjacent tiles. Very fun playstyle, however their damage can fall off a cliff the longer the run goes. Lotus and pumpkin, are in the very same boat. Pretty high initial cost, however they are absurdly cost effective, even though long term you might figure that their spreading effect is a little bit too slow to keep up with enemy scaling. So in the end there's much more to say about these crops, but we have to certainly come back to all of this in the advanced guide. Especially for all of this coffee, foxglove, tulsi and pepper shenanigans. So let's go to the next thing. So next up are all the instant use items, starting with the Dirt Monster Wand. This one can be like whatever or pretty much useless, or it can be the center of the universe because the swamp tiles, lava tiles and whatnot are getting way too annoying, so you want to get rid of this. Still, this item remains a little bit too tedious for me, but in the end, very useful. Next up is the dynamite. Long story short, you see it in the shop and you buy it almost instantly in 95% of the cases, because it is way too important. This is almost the same for the gardening hose, which turns ground to swamp. And the very important effect is that enemies walking over it get slowed down by 50%, and this can make a difference between getting swarmed or winning the round quite convincingly. Still, in the end, I cannot stress out enough how important it is to create swamp tiles in your maze. It is a really insane damage increase. So for the growth hormones, long story short, this one is an S tier item, especially combined with the corn and the windmills, making them much more cost effective. Next up is the Eye Scepter. It is a pretty complicated item to use and I've barely ever used this one so far. However, you can create pretty insane things with this one. Still, it's kind of tough for me to judge about this item correctly. Maybe it could be used for some meta strategies, maybe not. Maybe eventually this turns out to be super strong, but maybe this item falls off heavily at some point. Again, not so sure how to judge about this item correctly. So next up are the magic beans. They sow a random crop for 3 gold, and eventually, if you throw the dice, it is pretty much in your favor, as there are more higher quality crops than there are low quality crops. And this one is your get-go item if you want to play with the beehives. Next up is the manure. Long story short, pretty much mandatory for almost all of your runs. Toxic waste in the very same boat as the magic beans, even though a little bit less good, as it might take some time to mutate or spread, which might not be ideal with your beehive play. Still, once again, since there are more higher quality crops than low quality, this one stays also pretty good. So far to all the instant use items. Next up are all the other entities. Nothing too crazy here, lots of trees, lots of stones. However, nuclear bombs, you certainly want to let them explode. And later on the wasteland and portal maps, you may find multiple of those. If I remember correctly, I had rounds or days with like 12 or 13 at once, which led to a lot of free fertilized radioactive ground. To be honest, because of the nuclear bomb, wasteland might be one of my favorite maps. So next up is the totem pole. Enemies within 2 tiles get plus 25 armor, which means you practically want to dynamite these poles as soon as possible, because how impactful bonus armor for enemies is. Last but not least, the unicorn and the yak. Long term they can make a pretty big fat difference, considering all the free fertilized soil. Still, you might eventually also dynamite them to get rid of the blocking tile. So far 2 of the other entities. Now coming to the huge list of relics. In one sentence to the context, I am playing a lot of endless mode and daily challenges where you have to go as long as possible. This means my opinion about these items are very influenced by going as long as possible. Starting with one of the best items to go for day 40-ish runs. This one is pretty much mandatory. It's called a death cap. discover twice as many goblins each day. And this one also interacts with the treasure map, so even the treasure map will spawn 2 additional tiles, so plus 3 in total. Absolutely mandatory item if you want to go for as long as possible. Next up are the earthworms. They are very strong on paper, however I find this one kind of tough to use. So with the gumboots you are able to place your gnomes on swamp tiles. This one has to be skipped to the advanced guide as there might be a pretty strong playstyle related to these, which might be better to show with practical footage. Next up is the very strong jackhammer, which of course is kind of tough to use as you still have to invest the cost for the gnome to be placed around trees and stones and whatnot. Still, this one costs only 2 gold, it is an uncommon item, so it can be found relatively easily, and this one can make a massive difference in the early game. So partially it might feel like an S tier item, however because it's kind of tough to use, I give it A minus or something, maybe high B tier or something. Still, it can feel pretty strong at times. Next up is the meat item. Long story short, you pretty much have to skip this one to day 40-ish, because the penalty of minus 100% XP is way too terrible. It's pretty much not worth it early on. Maybe if you can offset the penalty with the lion's mane, but that would also require more slots and so on. Pesticides pretty much mandatory if you are going for a playstyle with weeds and crops, so nothing more to be said here. Piggy bank is very good on day 1 or day 2 shop, however its value falls off a cliff relatively early. Next up is the red hat. I personally don't have a strong feeling about this one because I also barely ever use this. However, potentially there might be a play later on when you have placed a lot of more new gnomes. Next up is the absurdly strong ancient seal. If you can find this one on the day 1 shop, this can create a pretty insane momentum in terms of economy, because the plus 10 gold each day will of course be reinvested into more actual economy. Still, you have to banish it at some point to not lose your run. Coal, no strong feeling about this one, I barely ever use this. Crown of Thorns, pretty much mandatory if you are going with a playstyle of weeds and crops. For the dice, no strong feeling about this one, as I barely ever use this. Same as the Dreamcatcher, same as the Garden Salad. Health Potion of course can be a run saver, and I pretty much always buy this one and banish it right away. Herbicide will get rid of weeds, because they cannot grow on fertilized soil anymore. Of course, very strong if you are playing with the daisies early on. Next up is the Master Broth. Long story short, I barely ever use this one, and still I'm not even sure if you will eventually get more health the more mushrooms you have. Next up is the Mirror. As you might can imagine, pretty much mandatory long term, as it is one of the strongest items in the game. Palantir, as I said, a little bit in a weird spot, because the +1 range looks a bit laughable. However, being able to place the wizards a little bit more far away can make a massive difference in certain setups. Philosopher's Spoon, as said before, extremely strong early on to the mid game. Later on, you might find you in a situation where you have to banish it, and all of a sudden your barrels do not count as houses anymore, so eventually the 1 item slot might be much more valuable if used for damaging items. So the Philosopher's Spoon, a little bit in a weird spot. Maybe it's okay to give this one a B+ or something in a tier list, not so sure. Piggy bank and the prayer beads, long story short, no strong feeling about this one, but still eventually with the prayer beads there might be some good tactics or strategies together with some roses. Next up are the shackles. Long story short, this one item certainly flies with the speed of light directly into S tier. You will save up your population, which will make of course a massive difference throughout the entire run. Still, however, you have to be pretty sure about your positioning with your gnomes. Once again, absolutely deserved S tier item. So for the shopping basket and the sundial, long story short, I barely ever used them, so no strong feeling about these. So for the toilet paper, this one is in the very same boat as the earthworms. They should be strong, however, I find this one kind of tough to use to their highest effect. Next up is the wolf claw. If you are able to alternate your gnomes with some houses, of course, kind of good. Even more so when you find all of the other wolf items together with the full moon. All of the wolf set items can make a massive difference throughout the run, and for some of the Steam achievements these are absolutely mandatory. However, in a normal day 40-ish run, the item slot might be much more efficient with something else. Now coming to the airdrop, of course this one has some great potential. However, I don't like its RNG nature, so I barely ever used this one. So the bagpipe together with the kilt can create a pretty insane early game where one gnome kills all of the enemies and you invest all of your gold into practical income. However, it's also kind of risky. It's a fun playstyle, however this is not going for too far, and eventually you might banish the bagpipe and the kilt to transition into a normal kind of game. So for the black hole, of course you buy it and banish it right away to receive plus 4 banishes in total for a gold cost of 4. Next up is the blood chalice, which we have to skippity skip to the advanced guide, as this one can lead to a pretty insane strategy related with some roses. Bone chimes super strong early on up to the mid game. However, later on you might also want to banish this as the income from it falls off a cliff. Also, we will talk at the end of the video about this one. So for the fly agaric, I asked some Discord people to do the math behind it, and it turns out that this item is pretty damn terrible, because eventually the bonus damage is somewhere at around plus 10%-ish, and in my own opinion the plus 25% cooldown is absolutely terrible, as your gnomes might not get a very important attack off. So this item can be pretty much run throwing and should be skipped to the later days when you are going for the full volley, the full set bonus of the mushrooms. Next up is the garlic necklace. Of course, if you are playing with the garlic, you want this item, and in addition, of course, the butterfly. Pretty strong combination early on. However, you have to get lucky to find all of this. Next up is the green thumb. This one gets straight up with the speed of light into the S tier. No other opinion allowed, no other opinion possible. Still, it can be kind of tough to use this one correctly, but if you are able to do so, it is a very deserved S tier. Next up is the hammer, so plus 1 health each day. If you are able to find the flame on top of that, which has a penalty of minus 1 health each day, but plus 30% damage, this one becomes kind of good in the mid game. So for the item called Hoe, I don't have a strong opinion about this one. I find this one super strong, but also relatively tough to use at times. Still, if you are using a lot of daisies, this one can be insanely strong. Ice skates for now are skipped because I barely have ever used them so far. Still, I see some potential. Kiss of Death, of course, very strong if you are going for a playstyle together with the Briar Heart. So next up is the mystery box. Long story short, I barely ever use this one because I kind of hate its RNG nature. Still, you might find something good, and eventually it's probably very worth the 4 gold. However, this item is not for me. The sun, we have already talked about this one. Kind of okay if you go with sunflowers. However, this item and the sunflowers are not for me anymore, as I find them too low quality. Next up are the wolf items, of course, super strong if you can alternate your gnomes with houses. Other than that, I barely ever use these. Body Song, of course, super strong if you are going to use a lot of knife gnomes. Next up is the Cursed Idol. This one is in the very same boat as the Ancient Seal. Pretty strong early on, but its value falls off a cliff relatively quickly. Still, you can create some sort of momentum early on with this. So the Fairy Bottle and the Foxglove are kind of tough to judge about correctly, because I still think it's super valuable later on to make your gnomes level up as soon as possible. However, the item slot is also pretty viable and might be eventually used for some damaging items. So again, really tough to judge about this Fairy Bottle and the Foxglove correctly. Next up is the Fishing Hook. If you have already a pretty long mace with some swarm tiles, this one can make a pretty massive difference. Partially in my runs, buying this one got me an income of plus 200 up to plus 500. Still, a gnome can only get plus 2 gold each day one time, so this item does not stack at all. Next up is the Fleam. Pretty strong if you can offset the penalty. So for the fruit baskets, I have barely ever used this one. Still, this one can make a massive difference, same as the Jackhammer. Still, this one can make a massive difference, especially in the early game. Next up is the Jack-o'-lantern. Long story short, I kind of hate it because I don't want my pumpkins to be trampled, so I've practically almost never used this one. Penny Bun, of course, absurdly strong if you go for the full set, the full volley of mushrooms. Later on, this item becomes absolutely mandatory. Plutonium Rod for the beans. No strong opinion about this one, as I have barely ever used it. Still, transitioning into a beehive economy with this one can be somewhat strong. Next up is the item called Supplies. The shop gets plus 1 item slot. I use this one every now and then. However, I also banish this one relatively quickly if there is something more important. Next up is the super strong Wheel of Fortune, which is of course in the very same boat as the airdrop. Its initial cost is absurdly low with the 5 gold, and you can roll pretty much all items in the game. However, due to its RNG nature, this item is not for me. Still, it can be quite fun to go for it. Next up is the mushroom called Chanterelle. This item stays strong throughout almost all phases of the game. However, for the most part, I'm skipping this one to the later days when I'm aiming for the full volley of mushrooms. Fool's Gold, no strong opinion about this one, as its value falls off quite heavily. Next up is the fragmentation rounds. Long story short, this one in the early game is one of the best items in the game, because all of the bonus damage can carry you through multiple days. Like, all of its kill speed efficiency is pretty safe, so you might reinvest all the gold you save to invest it into more actual economy. Full Moon, once again, if you can alternate your gnomes with the houses, super strong. However, I barely ever use this playstyle with the Full Moon and the wolf items. Next up is the Goblin Ear. Gnomes get plus 5% crit chance and plus 2 gold on a crit kill. Maximum of 2 gold per gnome per day. Long story short, this item flies straight up with the speed of light into the S tier. So not only is the income this one generates is way too crazy throughout a run, also the plus 5% crit chance is a little bit better than your usual crit chance, because basically every attacks from all of your gnomes are splashing, and each individual enemy hit has its own chance of receiving critical strike damage. So the 5% are a little bit better than actual 5%, if you kind of understand what I mean. Deserved S tier for this item. Killed, we already talked about this one with the bagpipes. So let's go to the Lion's Mane. This one, I like it a lot. However, for the most part, I'm skipping this one to the later stages of the game. because your gnomes are eventually leveling up anyway. Next up is the moral. If you can find the golden top on top of that, of course, super strong. However, for the most part, I'm skipping this one to the late game. Next up is the pipe for your spear gnomes. We have already talked about this one. You can create an absolute meat grinder with your spear gnomes. Very efficient, very fun playstyle. Powder charge, so blunderbuss gnomes get +1 damage. So these days I'm barely ever using this one, so let's go just over it. So let's ignore this one for now. Property Deed, super strong with the townsfolk. However, I find this one pretty tough to use correctly with every other guild. Still, this one remains pretty good in the early to the mid game. Still, long term it can be better to place actual gnomes for damage output. And later on you also find the statue which has a 2-tile radius, so your property deed will get obsolete. The quiver for your archer gnomes, kind of whatever, because later on you can place your coffee with the percolator. So for the sleeping potion, it's pretty strong early on to the mid game. However, I barely ever use this one because once again you cannot play around the fact that every stun effect has the same value as for the immunity, so I'm not so sure about the value for the sleeping potion anymore. Temple Bell, I kind of like it, but it's also kind of whatever. Sometimes I use it, sometimes not. So let's go next. So treasure map is absurdly strong early on, however you need the correct DPS to even be able to kill the harmless goblin, and if you are not able to kill it, he runs away with the 10 gold. Once again, long term, you want to combine the treasure map with the death cap to unlock as many tiles as possible, because these bonus tiles will translate to more economy and more damage output throughout the run. Whetstone, kind of whatever, and in the same boat as the powder charge. Nothing too crazy. Bodkin arrow stays pretty strong throughout the run to ignore enemies' armor. However, I don't think it's super mandatory at times. Kind of tough to judge about this item correctly, if I'm honest here. Next up is the bone item. This one goes straight up into S tier with a big fat plus behind it. This one is straight up one of the best items in the game. Not only will it give you a +5% crit chance, you will also receive +1 banish on a crit kill, which of course will give you control over RNG, control over the shop, control over your fate. However, you might want to first place a certain amount of gnomes to be able to use it to its full effect. If you have enough gnomes, you pretty much instantly buy this item because it's way too good. Next up is the Briarheart. Long story short, if you are going for a playstyle with crops and weeds, this one is pretty much mandatory, same as the related roses. So for the flannel shirt, of course, if you are going for a lot of X-gnomes, maybe on the jungle map, this one is pretty strong. Same as the morning star related to the flail gnomes, if you can get some additional crit chances. However, no strong opinion about these two items. Next up is the Pepper Axe, and to be honest, I still struggle to judge about this item correctly. I still have to do the analysis long term, because right now I still believe the monk rope strategy is a lot better. Rusty Shiv, of course, pretty strong for your knife gnomes, plus 33% crit chance. Pretty good throughout the entire run, even though you might want to banish it later on. Strategy manual, we already talked about this one. Absurdly strong if you are going for a meat grinder with your spear gnomes. Very fun playstyle, very efficient item. Next up is the summoning portal, which we straight up have to skip to the advanced guides. However, this one deserved a straight up S tier. So next up is the Berserker ring. For now, I don't want to judge about this one at all, because it still needs some analysis. It might be super strong, but it also might be kind of wonky to use. Gold Nugget is pretty good early on, however, its initial cost of 8 gold can be kind of tough. Next up is the Gold Top Mushroom. This one remains very strong throughout the entire game, even though you get a penalty of minus 100% experience, which still can be offset via Lion's Mane or via Foxglove. Still, this mechanic of minus 1 population is super strong. Next up is the Seed Pods. Of course, if you are using the Weeds Guild or you are placing lots of daisies early on, this one is very strong. However, since it is a rare item, it might be pretty tough to find. Tactics Manual, as you might be able to imagine, this one is super strong. However, this one is skipped for now to the advanced guide, as it would be much better to showcase this one with some practical footage. Next up is the Trowel. Long story short, I barely ever use this one. Still, it can have some good utility. But honestly, the rare type of item might be kind of too much to ask for. Maybe it would be fine to put this one into uncommon items. Blood Whip stays strong throughout the entire game if you are able to offset the penalty of minus 1 health for each day. Later on, this one becomes absolutely mandatory for damage output reasons. So the Bunk Bed is in the very same boat as the Philosopher's Spoon, super strong early on and in the mid game, but eventually the item slot might be much better used with some damaging items. Almost the same goes for the Butterfly, very strong early on to the mid game. However, later on this might be switched out. Ectoplasm is straight up skipped to the advanced guide, as this one is certainly better to showcase with some practical footage. Same as the Galaxy Hops, but long story short, this one is one of the strongest items in the game and absolutely mandatory for the so-called metagame. Sombrero, of course, very useful if not mandatory if you go for a cactus playstyle. Amulet of Stone Shaping, for the most part, it's not very good, but situational, it can feel like an S tier item as you are practically able to create a big, fat, gigantic mace to min-max your damage output. Next up is the Huckleberry Pie. Long story short, I barely ever used this one because I find the Huckleberries kind of terrible. Sapphire, of course, straight up goes into the S tier because eventually you want your maze take twice as long for the enemies to walk through. Strong Tubers, we already talked about this one. This one makes the yams extremely cost effective and one of the best crops early on because of their explosive nature. However, once again, you may want to transition into a higher quality crop or income in general. Barrow Armor, if you want to take the risk, of course, absurdly strong in the early and mid game. However, this one stays relatively risky, so for me it stays kind of wonky to use. Sometimes I use it, sometimes I straight up banish it. Executioner Hood, as cool as this one sounds, the minus 33% cooldown after killing an enemy only remains for the next attack, which means this item is straight up terrible. Maybe it's somewhat good early on to the mid game, but however, I basically always ignore it in 90% of the cases. Also because it's way too expensive. Monk Robes, of course, deserved S tier, and this is one of the main items, one of the main things of the so-called metagame. And this one might be the only reason why we were able to go for a very high day 40, if not day 50 kind of run. However, your Gnomes will not be able to crit anymore, which negates all types of bones or goblin ears or crit damage effects. So for the Shiitake mushroom, it's pretty much the same as for all mushrooms, skipped to the late game when you go for the full volley for the full set bonus. So the Berserker Amulet stays strong when you are able to use your crit chances. However, if you pick the Monk Robes, this item does not work at all anymore, so this one stays with a questionable value. Very strong if you crit, totally useless if you use the monk ropes. Next up is the absurdly strong recycling bin. This one flies straight up with the speed of light into the S tier. However, we have to skip this one to the advanced guide. Next up is the ruby, which is super strong yet expensive in the early game to the mid game. And of course, this one will increase your chances of getting banishes and economy via bone and goblin ear. Still, it's relatively costly, so you might think twice before buying it. Next up is the emerald. I think this one is straight up terrible. I barely ever used this one because the coffee play is so much more efficient or effective. Next up are the sewer pipes. Certainly strong when you go for a big fat maze of swamp tiles. However, its damage output falls off a cliff relatively early on. Or let's say the higher the day count, the worse this item gets. Crystal flute, long story short, this item is straight up terrible. Way too costly, way too terrible, and for me, I've barely ever used this one at all. Next up is the diamond. All of your gnomes get +1 damage. This one is skipped to the late game, as it is way too expensive in the early stages. However, this one stays absolutely mandatory later on. Next up is the wedding ring. Long story short, I personally don't like it too much, since it is kind of tough to use. However, you can do some pretty strong shenanigans with this. But nowadays, this item is not for me anymore. So the chili jam and the percolator, of course, in the very same boat. If you are planning to go for day 40-ish runs, these stay absolutely mandatory. And they very deserved S tier. Last but not least, the stingray barb. Very good if you are using the peppers. Very good if you are not using the monk rope. However, it's pretty costly and you may think twice before you buy it. So this item is a little bit in a tough spot because extremely expensive early on, and later on you may want to transition into the monk ropes. So not that sure about its actual value. So far to all the relics. So let's talk about some economy shenanigans you can do in this game. To the left there is a windmill and some corn. The build cost is 8 times 24, which is 192 for the corn, plus 9 for the windmill, which is a total cost of 201. And it will give you plus 96 income each day. So at day 3, you will pretty much make up some gold. That can be reinvested into more corn and more windmills. At the bottom is a goat times 24, related to all tiles of corn of course, which is an initial cost of 120 gold. This is leading to 48 gold saved each day that you would normally invest to manure the tiles instead. So it's 48 gold on one day, 96 on the second, 150-ish on the third, and after that you make up gold each day, which of course can be reinvested into more corn and eventually even more goats. To the right are some examples of why I believe the growth hormones deserve an S tier rating. You place one corn tile for 8 gold, you use the growth hormones on it, which is an investment of 14 gold, so you will save up 26 gold that you would normally invest with placing the corn manually. In addition, you can place a corn tile, hold down the left mouse button and aim towards a direction to spread the corn anywhere you want, which is of course one of the most cost-effective plays in the entire game, at least in context of normal crops and income. So far to some economy shenanigans. Next picture shows the full set of mushrooms, so eventually you will end up with plus 8 gold, plus 5 health via master broth, which is kind of whatever, so I personally don't buy this one as it is way too weak for the late game circumstances. Still, the plus 80% damage via penny bun is kind of good, even though the monk robe is relatively speaking much more stronger. On top of that, you get plus 300% experience via Lion's Mane, minus 100% via Gold Top. And the most important thing is plus 8 absolute damage via Moral. So this is pretty much the moral of the story. In addition, plus 33% crit chance. In addition, plus 35% crit chance, which will be negated via monk ropes. And also, the higher cooldown from the fly agaric will be negated by some coffee with the percolator. Also, the population penalty and bonus will get negated entirely, so the gold top will get obsolete with the moral. Last but not least, there is a bonus for being near to trees. Still, this one is kind of tough to use, and eventually you might better place some more gnomes or statues instead of trees, at least for the most part. Now, last but not least, finally talking about the very strong mechanic of banishes. These of course are used to remove items from the game, from your buildable line and from the shop. But one of the most important or main factors is that it actually rerolls an item slot, which helps of course with the RNG. Now currently the game has 130 items roughly, so in context of RNG you still need and want quite a lot of banishes. So the first few items on the screen, Dreamcatcher, Piggy Bell, Prayer Beads, Black Hole, are not very good. Now coming to the body tree, later on, if you have a crazy good economy, you want to draw a block holding down the left mouse button, then you press the related number on your keyboard, you place a ton of body trees, you dynamite it right away, and you repeat this over and over again to gain a ton of banishes, which of course will also increase your damage via monk ropes. In addition, there is a play with the Talsies, but I will showcase this in the advanced guide. Temple Bell, relatively speaking, is kind of whatever because the play with the body tree, placing and deleting them is much more efficient than anything the Temple Bell would give you. Still, the banishes from the Temple Bell can be quite influential over the course of the run, same as the one from the churches. Now, just recently I realized more and more that placing a ton of houses and churches is of course good to gain banishes. Still, it is much more efficient to use the corn and the windmills and translate the gold income via body trees to banishes, and as a result into damage output. So coming to the bone, of course you want to use all of your crits for as long as possible, as long as you can survive with this. Still, eventually you want to use the monk robe, which means your bone is not working anymore and you can pretty much banish it. Now the bone chimes are in a little bit of a special spot because when you find both the chimes and the body tree, you pretty much gain control over the shop because a body tree costs 2 gold, you gain a banish from them, you use the banish in the shop and you regain the gold, which can be repeated indefinitely until you have everything you want. Now coming to the very strong mirror, which is absolutely mandatory later on. What you can do is, if you have banished everything, you can start all over, get another cycle if you need other items. This is because you can in fact not banish the mirror at all, so on and so forth. And if you are super short on gold, you can even click banish on the mirror indefinitely and get a ton of gold via bone chimes. Only from your slots of items. And last but not least, of course, the monk robes negates every crit interaction because later on it is way too crazy to offset the penalty for the crit chances. Still, in some specific cases, you might even be able to place so much pepper that you can get both the bonus damage and some crit. Still, I'm not really sure how far this strategy, this playstyle is viable. So far to this short beginner guide for Gnomes tower defense. The advanced guide is coming in some weeks, and feel free to drop a subscription as I'm still currently working on getting partnered via YouTube. Thanks in advance. I'm out, see ya in the future.